Well, this story is about a small and relatively little known school outside of Chambersburg. It's also a story about Pennsylvania. From the students who came from all corners of the state to the staff in Franklin County and surrounding areas, and to the legislature and the governor's office, from the beginning to the end.
Today, our guest is Bill Peck. He's our moderator. He's also getting some help from Martha Gold today, which is a real pleasure to have a couple people. And I just wanted to let everyone know that thank you for coming out a great deal. And I'll hand it over to you, Bill, if you don't mind, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So actually, I'm not going to introduce myself because you hear it during my presentation. Martha Gold worked with her father to write a book on the original Soldiers Orphan Schools program, 1864 to 1889. And she's the one that put this video together that I'm about to show. So many thanks to her. And then it's about 15 minutes. And after that video, then I'll do a PowerPoint, which should go about 30 minutes. I'll, try to mind the time, of course, and then course discussion. So here goes. I'm going to start the video.
Thousands of soldiers were killed during the American Civil War. But what happened to their children? Initially, only one northern state took on the task of caring for the Civil War orphans. Prior to the war, there were few private orphanages who cared for around 900 children. An orphan child had no place to turn, only almshouses where they had to work for room and board. After the war, the number of orphans jumped to an estimated 15,000. Both in the rural areas of Pennsylvania as well as the cities, widows were left destitute, unable to care for themselves, let alone their children, creating half-orphans. Thousands of youngsters were suddenly on their own. They were dubbed street urchins or ragamuffins. In 1863, the Philadelphia Inquirer described the events of a reception for the famous minister, Henry Ward Beecher, where Governor Andrew Curtin called upon the citizens to come to the aid of the Civil War orphans. Later, the governor claimed that his inspiration came from a chance meeting. On Thanksgiving Day, he heard a knock on the front door of the executive mansion. Opening the door, he discovered two small children, a boy and his sister, clad in rags, shivering and begging for food. They said that their father had been killed in battle and that their mother had just died. Curtin exclaimed, "Is it possible that the people of Pennsylvania can feast this day while the children of her fallen soldiers beg bread from door to door?" In 1864, through Curtin's efforts, private boarding schools for the soldiers' orphans were created. Few know about this forgotten history, the notorious scandals, sorrows and successes which acted as a springboard for ongoing orphan care in Pennsylvania, ultimately changing the lives of thousands of veterans' children. Among all the governors of the northern states, none more strongly supported the Union cause than Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania. The Dean of Modern Pennsylvania Historians wrote, "The heroic role of Andrew Gregg Curtin stands head and shoulders above all the other governors of the loyal states as a tremendous wartime leader." Curtin tried to ease the life of the soldiers once they went to the front lines. A special state agency was set up in Washington, D.C. to look after the needs of Pennsylvania soldiers. State agents were sent into the field to make sure the sick and wounded received proper care. Curtin started the practice of returning bodies to the soil of their native state and proposed a national cemetery to fulfill his promise to look after the widows and children of the fallen. Curtin personally went to the front lines to visit the troops and the wounded in the hospitals. Governor Curtin won the devotion of the Pennsylvania troops. He was hailed as the soldiers' friend. Once Governor Curtin made known his desire to help the soldiers' orphans, the actual founding was anticlimactic. The legislature gave their approval to aid the children. Orphans would be placed in private institutions using a $50,000 gift from the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1866, the legislature passed another bill appropriating $300,000 for the schools. Finally, in 1867, the legislature gave its final approval and set up a state agency to oversee the private schools where the orphans had been placed. He ended his official association with the schools in 1867. In 1881, at a reunion of the alumni of the schools, a journalist reported that tears coursed down the cheeks of the former governor as he looked upon the faces of those he had found in cellar and garret. Andrew Gregg Curtin must be given most of the credit for the establishment of the Soldiers Orphan Schools of Pennsylvania. A well-defined hierarchy of officials regulated the lives of the soldiers' orphans. They were real schoolmen and not humanitarians. At the top of the pyramid was the state superintendent of the soldiers' orphans. He prescribed the rules and regulations for the schools, approved the admission of the children, and visited the schools. All four men who filled this position were veteran educators. Thomas Henry Burroughs, the first superintendent, and James Pyle Wickersham were probably the most famous educators of the day in Pennsylvania. Also educators, George McFarland and lastly, Elisha Higby. Two other members of the Central Department, a man and a woman, were the inspectors. They visited the schools to see if the superintendent's mandates were being carried out. The most interesting of the inspectors was Elizabeth E. Hutter. At 17, she married Edwin Hutter, who became Secretary of State James Buchanan's private secretary in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Hutter was described as a star of Washington society. Then tragedy struck when their two sons died of scarlet fever. They moved to Philadelphia, where Edwin became a minister and Elizabeth founded an orphanage, the Northern Home for Friendless Children. When the Civil War started, both went to the front to help the wounded, even receiving a special train from President Lincoln to go to Gettysburg in 1863. Mrs. Hutter remained an inspector for years, up until the scandal erupted. At the central office in Harrisburg, there were 3 male clerks who kept the record book. Here the dominant figure was Colonel James L. Paul. He wrote a history of Soldiers Orphan Schools in 1873. Colonel Paul was accused in the 1880s of profiting from the infamous syndicate, to which he assigned the pupils. He was fired due to his alleged role in the scandal. Once the program began, those who were in charge were quick to justify the system. They stressed 3 arguments. First, it was necessary to demonstrate that orphans were a social menace. The orphans were pictured as coming from an environment of neglect and want, not from homes of ignorance and vice. The children arrived at the schools in such a miserable state. They were covered with vermin and infected with disease. They were ignorant, very dull, and stupid. Worst of all was their moral character. They possessed moral deformities, disobedience, quarrelsomeness, lying, idleness, and kindred vices. Practically all used foul language, some addicted to tobacco. School records referred to individual delinquents. One boy was known as a Pittsburgh rat, the most unpromising of boys. The second part of their argument: what would happen if the child did not continue to receive the saving grace of the Commonwealth? The word was crime. They proclaimed that a homeless child, if left to his own devices, would grow up not a plague to himself but a nuisance to society. They would probably end up on the gallows. Superintendent Burroughs stated, of the 1,510 convicted criminals in New York, 627 were orphans or half-orphans. In Pennsylvania, 516 out of 962, or more than half, were virtually orphans. In Maryland, out of 537 convicts, 260 were orphans. Finally, there was the economics of law enforcement. Although thousands of dollars were being spent on the orphans, this was a small expenditure compared with the millions that the state was saving on police protection and prison internment. If it had not been for the schools, the state would be spending 10 times over on jails and penitentiaries. Certainly, it was better to spend the money on educating the children to become good citizens rather than for crime protection or to build penitentiaries. If they had the facilities, existing organizations admitted the soldiers' orphans under the new program, while other orphanages such as the Lincoln Institute in Philadelphia were created. Major General George Meade was the school's first president. Said of the general, his energy and aid contributed to bringing about the remarkable result that in 9 weeks the money was raised, the house was bought, and the work begun. And the eye that had witnessed the self-sacrifice of the fathers never faltered in its watchfulness for the welfare of the children. Some of the schools initially started in private homes or as a humanitarian effort. In 1863, Emmanuel and Christiana Beringer opened the Shepherd of the Lambs Orphanage in their own home at 702 Morris Street in Philadelphia. The number of children quickly grew, and the orphanage moved to Bridesburg, then later, renamed Bethany, to Wilmersdorf. The majority of schools were located in extremely rural areas. These locations were justified in terms of fresh air and water. The Uniontown School in the Allegheny Mountains was selected so the children could breathe pure air and drink pure mountain water. At the Mercer School, nature's sweet and vocal system inhabit the grove. Hartford School was an elevated one on the spine of the Blue Mountains. The Bridgewater School, created for the colored soldiers' orphans, was beautifully located on the Delaware, easily reached by boat. These locations were planned to deal with several challenges, from financial considerations to the perceived problem of the interference of the mothers. The rural locations made for difficult travel for the mothers. To get to the Dayton School, a mother must take the Allegheny Valley Railroad to Kittinig, then travel by stagecoach another 22 miles. Another benefit of the rural locations, it made it hard for an unhappy student to run away, which was a great embarrassment for officials. Once a young orphan arrived, they quickly knew that they had entered a well-regulated existence. Everything was done by the tap of a bell and was obeyed with soldier-like precision. The purpose of these schools was schooling and not benefice care. Superintendent Burroughs set up a complicated educational plan which seemed to have been followed faithfully for the 25-year history of the schools. Closely tied to intellectual training was the emphasis on military drills. Every institution had its corps of cadets who went through maneuvers on the school's parade ground. If the need should arise, the orphans would be ready to respond as their fathers had in 1862. Girls received calisthenics and performed dance programs as their form of physical training. But it was character education that mattered the most. To know what was morally good was more important than being intelligent if one could not be both. As to clothing, each of the boys wore a facsimile of the uniform of their deceased father. Most of the clothing were sewn up by the older girls in the sewing room. After breakfast each morning the orphans were inspected. Woe to the child who was missing a button or had failed to shine his shoes. He lost his play privilege for the day. Most of the schools had musical programs. The band at Chester Springs consisted of 13 pieces and was conducted by a teacher from Philadelphia. A field trip was exciting. The most famous was in 1865. 345 orphans were brought to Harrisburg and marched from the railway station to the Capitol building, loudly cheered by the crowd. The highlight of each year was the annual examination. This was a public event, and hundreds would attend, newspaper editors, mothers, and Grand Army members. The examination was completely oral and was more entertainment than a test. For over 20 years, the schools were described as one of the most successful philanthropic undertakings in the history of the state. February 22, 1886, the tabloid Philadelphia Record headline read, "Soldiers Orphans, a syndicate's traffic upon humanity. Official corruption, neglect, abuse." The article described how the once grand purpose of the schools was being prostituted for the sake of human greed and callous neglect. Profits as high as $50,000 a year were being rolled in by the private owners as they fed their charges for 3 cents a meal. Writer John Norris claimed it was the infamous Dotheboys Hall come to life. Like Squire Squeers of Dickens' fictional English boarding school, the proprietors of the schools, in their lust for money, had turned the state's pride into pest holes. The reaction to this revelation was swift. There were words of outrage on the front page of every newspaper. just as vehement was the anger of the 35,000 members of the state Grand Army of the Republic. While it had never had an official connection with the system, they had always taken an active interest in the institutions and had come to feel a duty to protect the welfare of the children of their fallen comrades. Only 2 days after the original record exposure, the state commander of the Grand Army announced that he was setting up a committee to investigate the schools. The Grand Army marches against the plunderers of the orphans. Governor Pattison, although he fired the inspectors, claimed that he could do nothing about the conduct of the private schools since they were the responsibility of the state legislature. The fate of the schools was not decided until March 1889. The private schools would all be closed and a central state industrial school would be opened with a broader acceptance of students. Much of the failure can be attributed to the state officials who administered the system. They neglected to institute industrial education and failed to supervise the private school owners and became far too involved with politics and profits. And so, the Civil War Soldiers Orphan Schools of Pennsylvania, 1864 to 1889, passed into history. For the most part, forgotten. But it surely reveals the patriotism and humanitarianism of the state. For the first time in the history of the nation, a government took on the care of veterans' children. The original spirit and intent of Curtin's program lived on at the Scotland Industrial School, where children were given institutional care by the state until 2009.
Okay, so that's the first part of our presentation. That's the video. You saw a book cover there right at the end. That book is definitely available on Amazon, and we can talk about that at the end. So now I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint, and I'll get started with that. So this is an artist rendering of the main building at Scotland School, which you saw a picture of at the end of the video, with 3 timeless men contemplating the lives of the children that they committed to care for. Well, this story is about a small and relatively little-known school outside of Chambersburg. It's also a story about Pennsylvania, from the students who came from all corners of the state to the staff in Franklin County and surrounding areas, and to the legislature and the governor's office, from the beginning to the end. There's a long lineage of students and their descendants sprinkled about the state, and now, of course, beyond. But the root of the school is intimately tied to the Civil War in the state of Pennsylvania. Originally, the school was named Soldiers Orphan Industrial School as a testament to the importance of learning a trade. So I want to tell a quick story, which I think is a good parallel to the overall SOS program, and in particular to Scotland School. Last March, by a miracle, I found my father's records from this orphanage just outside of York from 1927, when he was 5 years old. The records were well preserved, and I was able to tap into my grandmother's family, of whom I knew nothing about. In the course of researching this, I was able to meet a second cousin, meaning that we shared a great-grandfather. He had done some fairly extensive research on the family, and we met last summer and had a good time talking about our common ancestry. We were like old friends right from the start. So briefly on my personal Scotland background, my dad went to Scotland when he was 6 years old after this school, along with his brother and sister, then 7 and 8. He graduated in 1942. Then after World War II in college, he spent his entire career at Scotland as coach, teacher, and administrator, and his last job was as assistant superintendent. I spent my early years following him around football games and practice and playing in the old gym. This would have been in the 60s and early 70s, and I lived a lot of what I'm about to tell you, but it's not about me. I'm here to tell the story of the students and the staff, faculty, and coaches. My mother also graduated from Scotland in 1950. She was from Philadelphia and started in the 5th grade. Both my parents had siblings and ancestors that also went to Scotland. The next slide gives my overall perspective on Scotland School. About the same time of finding my dad's records in Abbottstown, I reconnected to the Scotland alumni, many of whom I knew from being at Scotland as a kid. Then last summer, I found Dr. Gold's book on the original SOS program, which I promptly devoured. Then it hit me. The Scotland alumni are the living legacy of this program, roughly in the same way I had found a living relative of my dad. So while you won't learn any Civil War history from the story of Scotland, the overarching umbrella is the backdrop of the Civil War and the original SOS program, always with an emphasis on discipline, morals, and military focus. I feel that Scotland is not only a legacy of the SOS program, but the fulfillment of the original vision of Governor Curtin. And as we go through these slides, I hope you'll see the original SOS program played out at Scotland School with several references to Governor Curtin. The next few slides show the campus as it was in its heyday. Here's an aerial view of the Scotland campus. It's 165 acres, basically out in the country just north of Chambersburg, with the village of Scotland nearby. On the right is, in the tree lines, is a rail line, which is one of the considerations in choosing the location for the single school. To the top left are the home-like cottages that I'll talk about, and I'll show some pictures of in several other slides. This is the classic view of the main administration building, which is one of the two original buildings from 1895. To the far left is the school building, which was built in 1932. And to the far right, just past the tree, is the swimming pool built in 1958. The official name of the building, just to the left of the main building, is Curtin Hall, but it was commonly referred to as the chapel or the auditorium. This is the original gym, which is still usable, and in which I watched many games in the 60s and early 70s, and where I spent a lot of time with my dad. This is the new gym, which is a great facility and which saw a lot of success, particularly in basketball. In the top left is the swimming pool that I had mentioned 2 slides back. At Scotland, religious and moral upbringing was a mainstay of the program, and this was clearly one of the key components of the original schools. Even at reunion dinners today, they say the Scotland prayer before the meal. Students could go to services in Chambersburg, typically the Catholic Church, plus a Lutheran minister would come on Sunday. The local Jewish synagogue also hosted students during the holy days, and in the 80s and beyond, Muslim clerics would come to minister to those students. This is an early picture of the bridge known as the pond entrance. It goes across a creek, and just past the entrance is a pond. Here's an early picture of the 2 original buildings. In the back is the maintenance building, which burned to the ground in 1901, thankfully with no loss of life, but it destroyed all equipment for the trades and all band instruments. The quote is from the Chambersburg paper just after the fire. The student being interviewed also boasted that girls behaved first rate. Some of them cried, but there wasn't a sign of panic. Our whole year's work was up in that building, and lots of work we were doing for Chester Springs and some of the other orphan schools. Plus, there's a picture of the pond just across the bridge. It was a delightful play area in summer and winter for the students as well as the locals. Here's another picture of girls having winter fun at the pond. At the back left is the farmhouse. The farm was a mainstay at the school until the 50s, with vegetables, chickens, and a small herd of cows. The farmhouse still exists and was recently renovated inside. Here's a classic train picture with students waiting to board. As mentioned, the Scotland farm was chosen due to its central location and closeness to a rail line. It's still an operational track today. My mother, class of 50, told me how she rode the train to and from Philadelphia. The patriotic debt was one of the key drivers of the program from the beginning until the end. Veterans organizations throughout the state were always enthusiastic supporters of Scotland for the bulk of the school's history. Governor Curtin's vision played out successfully for 145 years, despite some significant bumps along the way, coupled with the constant cloud of financial pressure. The state wanted to provide a foundation for the students so they could gain a life for themselves and be productive citizens, and Scotland did just that. In a later slide, I'll show families where multiple siblings attended and graduated, which speaks to the success of the school and the trust that the families placed there. As I've seen in attending recent reunions, the former students relive their childhood and high school memories shared with their Scotland brothers and sisters, as well as remembering the dedicated staff who loved them, taught them, and disciplined them. By the time the planning for Scotland was in the works, Governor Curtin had been gone from the governor's office for 20 plus years. But the overarching purpose always remained the same: to care for the children of the state's veterans. Keeping Governor Curtin's name and vision alive was seen in several ways at the school, from the Curtin Literary Society that was instituted in 1906 to the official name of one of the early buildings that I mentioned earlier. After the scandal of 1886, the legislature wanted to do things differently. With the Act of 1893, the schools would be run by a commission as opposed to a superintendent. As noted on the slide, the GAR had a strong influence in the startup of the school, as well as in the formative years, both in advocating for the care of the veterans' children and officially as part of the commission. When the school opened, students completed their studies at age 16. The 16er pin is from my grandfather, who graduated Scotland in 1902. The pin was made by Bastian Brothers of Rochester, who was a longtime manufacturer of pins and buttons. In 1905, students were permitted to stay until age 18. Here's a list of the GAR members of the original commission. And in the additional resources document is a nice article of the GAR of Chambersburg, Hosum Post 309. This is the main entrance of Scotland. The plaque is dedicated in memory of the GAR, presented in 1955 by the Pennsylvania Department Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War and the Auxiliary. In the bonus slides are pictures of a plaque on the other side of this structure that lists members of the commission at that time that placed the plaque in the Board of Trustees of the school. Here are the three remaining schools when Scotland opened in 1895. Eventually, all students transferred to Scotland when capacity allowed for it. Hartford School in Susquehanna County, Northeast, closed in 1902. Uniontown, also known as Jamonville, in Fayette County, closed in 1908, and Chester Springs closed in 1912. My mother had a great aunt and uncle at Hartford School, who then transferred to Scotland in 1899. My father had aunts and uncles that went to Chester Springs, then transferred to Scotland in the early 1900s. This is the annual report of the commission from 1895 when Scotland started. The annual reports are a great source of information of the schools, listing all students' names, birth dates, date of admission, parents' name, and the father's military unit. I used this book to help a Chambersburg friend find out about their great-grandparent and two of his siblings, and she was very excited to learn of this part of her family history. There are 4 Pennsylvania schools from the same time period and all taking care of orphans. Each of these schools had a single founder with a lot of money, whereas Scotland School did not have a single founder who had a unifying vision for the school. But Scotland did follow the overarching mission of caring for the children of the state's veterans. Girard College was found specifically for white male orphans, while Scotland was always integrated from the earliest years, but obviously predominantly white. Girard went through an upheaval in the 60s when they integrated, whereas Scotland became 90% Black by the 1990s until it closed. I heard from the Scotland Museum director that the first Black student came to Scotland in 1898. He was not able to confirm that date because the museum is all in storage now. And here's overlap with the Carlisle Indian School from 1906 with a non-politically correct headline. Of course, it was a different time. Scotland only played the Carlisle junior varsity and third teams. Jim Thorpe would have been 18 in 1905, but there's no record of him playing in any sports against Scotland, since he would have been on the varsity teams. This was printed in the school newspaper by the print shop. There were other states with similar missions, but they were all state-owned and single schools, whereas in Pennsylvania's original program, the many schools were privately owned. Pennsylvania's decentralized approach allowed for more students to be enrolled than the other states. The commission also visited schools in Indiana, Toledo, Chicago, Rochester, New York, and a Jewish school in Cleveland. While the state was committed to caring for the soldiers' children, they always felt it would be short-term. After the initial wave of children from the Civil War, they adjusted entrance requirements that took into account the infirmities or death of the soldiers well after the war ended. Scotland opened in 1895, but then 3 years later, there was another war that resulted in the same need for the children of veterans. This is a list of Scotland grads who served in the Spanish-American War. This is about a third of the Scotland graduates who fought in World War I. And my grandfather, who had that 16er pen, is listed at the top right, class of 1902. And here's about a third of the Scotland grads from World War II. My dad and his brother, Charles, are listed at the bottom left. And the stream of Scotland graduates serving in the U.S. military continued unabated until it closed. This slide is from a recent Facebook post with service periods ranging from 1958 to 2011. There are, of course, many, many others through the years. In all the years of Scotland, there was always a military component that taught not only discipline, but love of country. In the 80s, the JROTC program was instituted and was very successful. When the new single state-sponsored school was being considered in the 1890s, two of the key factors were industrial training and moving away from the dormitory model into a more nurturing and home-like environment. These two components were key to the school's success, and you still hear the stories about the trades and cottage life at gatherings. And here's the trade building with the motto, dedicated to the dignity of labor. I recently found a story from Chester Springs about a family of 4 that needed schooling. One of the children was a dwarf, so they ended up sending her to Scotland so she could make her own clothes. While family setting was one of the original goals of the early planners of the single school, construction of the cottages did not begin until 1927. In the center, near the top of the picture is a clock tower that's one of the iconic structures on the campus and which always brings back a flood of memories of former students, and I've superimposed it here on the right. As I just mentioned, the cottages were a key goal of the new school, but the first 5 cottages were not opened until 35 years after the school opened. Eventually, there were 19 classic cottages built, plus other college-style buildings built in the 60s. So now I have some historical pictures. This is the 1902 diploma of my grandfather, Percy Peck. His father was a Civil War veteran, as noted on the diploma. The blow-up, I know it's hard to read, but it states that his father fought during the suppression of the rebellion. The band was a great ambassador for Scotland for many parades, typically in Philadelphia or Harrisburg. The band was invited to play in the GAR parade at their 50th anniversary in Harrisburg, but rain canceled the event. Sports, and in particular football, was a mainstay at Scotland from the very beginning. This was from the team that scalped the Carlisle Indians from an earlier slide. And the lad at the top left is a 14-year-old sergeant from 1906. Here's several pictures of the girls' teams. Croquet in 1907. Field hockey in 1934. And basketball, 1935. Here's the entire student body from 1935 in front of the school building that was built 3 years earlier. None of Scotland's success could have happened without a dedicated staff. There are many such pictures in the Scotland 100-year anniversary book, but many testimonials of the impact of teachers, house parents, and coaches. Whether it's from 1910 to 1990, it was always the same. Dedicated staff raising children who came from vulnerable homes and giving them love, morals, and industrial training. Now I have some additional men's sports pictures and then some more recent pictures. Baseball team from 1915. And 2 short years after the school opened, they beat rival Chambersburg in baseball. The mindset of the student reporting is enlightening. The boys and girls of Scotland were as happy as though they had been sliding down a rainbow with a star-spangled banner in one hand and a yard of bologna sausage in the other. Here are 2 African Americans, a drummer from 1913, drumsticks in hand, and a basketball player from 1931. Here's the 1931 undefeated football team. The basketball player from the previous slide is the second player from the right on the first row, and his younger brother is on the next slide. Coach Cap Heckler there was the 1923 grad, then coach of pretty much every boys sports team. He was a boys supervisor and military instructor. He was strict but fair disciplinarian. He made little girls and boys' knees knock, including me when I visited him with my dad. But he was the father to thousands of students who had no father. In 1973, his son became superintendent for 5 years. Here is the younger brother of the basketball player that we just saw in 2 slides and then on the football team. After World War II, the younger brother earned undergraduate and graduate degrees from Howard University. He was married for 48 years and had 4 sons and 2 daughters. For 37 years, he was a chemist for the Department of the Navy Surface Weapons Center. And here he is at the 1993 reunion. Here's a classic photo of military drill of the commissioned officers from 1938, plus a dear little sergeant from the 20s. World War II era photo. The men in uniform are likely from a local veterans group, and my dad is on the far left. This is the earliest yearbook I could find. Scotland yearbooks are especially treasured keepsakes by the students because they lived together for the better part of 12 years, going through the same experience of not having a stable home. This dedication from 1943 is especially touching since many of their former classmates were already at war and now their fellow graduates were heading in the same direction. It's another classic picture of life in Scotland, especially the girls at drill around 1950. My aunt is on the left, in 1929 at age 7, and then her graduation in 1941. On the right is my mom with a big smile, which is how I remember her by. Boys basketball had a lot of success over the years, mainly with District 3 championships. Here's a classic photo of the first grade from 1962 of the class of 1973. Those still living are in their late 60s now, many of whom are still active in the alumni. Fast forward 20 years from the previous photo, here's another classic photo of the second grade from the early 80s. The two young fellas in the top row were part of the state football championship in 1992, which I'll show next. One was a quarterback and the other was a star player. And here's the state football champs from 1992. This was, of course, a great accomplishment for the school and the players. The lessons they learned propelled them to successful careers and families. In particular, Ken Katusen on the right had a tremendous impact on the students for over 30 years. In the center is Governor Robert Casey. The year prior to this picture, he had wanted to close the school, and this was the start of the budget battle that lasted almost 20 years until the school closed in 2009. 2 years after the football championship, they added a basketball championship, state basketball championship, with many of the players from the football team. Scotland also won track state championships in 1991 and 1992, so it was a great 3-year run for the players and the school. The big fellow on the bottom left is John Thornton, who went to West Virginia to play football and then had an 11-year career with the Cincinnati Bengals and the Tennessee Titans. Many players through the years went to play sports in college. In the 80s and 90s, students were mostly from Philadelphia, and a fair number played football at Temple, Cheney, Boston College, and many other schools, typically in Pennsylvania. One reason Scotland was a little-known school was because of its success, coupled with lack of controversy. Here are 2 quotes from Chambersburg public opinion sports reporters from the 70s through the 90s. Each had a high regard of both the Scotland kids and the coaches. Many families sent multiple children to Scotland from the earliest days and beyond. My father had 3 siblings and my mother had 1 sister. This slide is just a small list of such families. Plus, I added the DeLong family from 1895 with 3 siblings. In the bonus slides, I have additional information on the DeLong family, where they're from, their dates of birth, and so on. As mentioned, there was always a military component at Scotland from the earliest days. By the 1980s, JRTC was implemented and it had great success, winning many awards and teaching lifelong skills and building confidence. This picture, I think, encapsulates the school's success. Scotland breathed life into the students, and they, in turn, breathed life into their children. 3 of the children in the front went to Harvard, and 1 graduated from Tufts, with the young lady at the bottom right having just been commissioned a few weeks ago in the Air Force. Her brother next to her is in the Army ROTC. The fellow in the red on the right, in the middle, is a 1996 Scotland grad, then a 2001 West Point graduate. He's now CEO of a rideshare business in Massachusetts. He and his wife were both the result of their parents' teenage pregnancy, but he made a life for himself through the foundation he received at Scotland School, and then he passed his foundation on to his two children. And that's his quote about fostering generational growth and success. To me, the smiles tell the story. I've only met the West Point grad, but I could easily strike a conversation with anyone in this picture because of our shared connection. In the bonus slides, I show several other successful students, but it's a very small sample. As I mentioned earlier, Governor Casey had initially proposed severe cuts that would close the school in 1991, but Scotland prevailed at the time, although the fight continued. Ultimately, they lost the battle in 2009 when the school closed. The school had several owners after it closed and is now home to a Jewish group from New York that is transforming it into a summer camp. In 2010, after the school closed, Valley Forge Military Academy wanted to purchase it, and they had grand plans, but the state gave them the runaround, and so nothing happened. Back in 2000 or thereabouts, Milton Hershey made overtures to purchase the campus, but this too never happened. Most of the buildings now are in bad shape, but the Jewish camp is putting a lot of work into many of the buildings. It's at least good that they're bringing children to the campus, but it won't be in full operation until next summer. I got about 3 more slides. Like many of you in your interest, we hope to preserve the legacy of the SOS program through Scotland School. I personally think it's a great story of Pennsylvania honoring their patriotic debt, plus a great story of the success of the graduates, which is a testament to the dedicated staff for 114 years at Scotland. The timeless story of students that came from vulnerable families, with the students gaining a foothold in life that they virtually all recognized was a positive and life-changing experience for them. And they remain connected to their Scotland brothers and sisters. Even if they graduated many years apart, they can easily strike up a conversation like they were old friends. I do feel that the Scotland alumni represent the living legacy of the original SOS program. That's why I shared the story at the very beginning about finding an unknown but close relative, as it connected me to a past I had no idea about. And I do think that Governor Curtin would be extremely proud. Nobody ever questioned the success of Scotland, but in 2009, the journey ended. Despite the budget cloud for 20 years, it was still quite a shock to the students, parents, and staff when they received the news. The alumni hold near and dear their memories of their shared experience, and they would love to go stroll about their former home and recount their early years, but at the moment, there is no official access. So that's it. Martha and I appreciate this opportunity to tell the story of the SOS program and Scotland School.